Welcome to the Partnership for Food Safety Education Knowledge Exchange. This is where we take a short time to get very specific on one topic and really give you some key takeaways. Today we have with us Dr. Elizabeth Andress. She's Professor Emerita of the University of Georgia. I welcome you to this height of summer. We're going to talk about home canning, home food preservation with the leading expert in the United States. So let me quickly introduce her. She retired in December 2020, Elizabeth, from her role as head of the National Center for Home Food Preservation at the University of Georgia. She's a retired extension food safety specialist. She completed 42 and a half years in extension service, starting as a county educator in Pennsylvania, served as a state specialist in Florida and Georgia, and also as national program leader for food science at USDA for several years. Dr. Andress is the co-author of the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning since the first edition came out in 1988. She's assisted thousands of home food preservers across the U.S. and beyond. In addition to serving Georgia educators and consumers for 29 years, she's provided 24 food preservation training sessions for extension faculty in 19 other states. So she's the teacher of the teachers. Several have been hands-on multi-day workshops. She's co-editor of So Easy to Preserve, which is sold by the University of Georgia. And in her first few months in retirement, she's been busy creating archives of food preservation history, but she soon hopes to get back to her piano playing and to her genealogy projects. So we'd love you to ask questions. Of course, we'd also love you to post, where are you joining us from? So if you're joining us live, please put something in the comments and let us know. Elizabeth, we've got just about 25 minutes, so let's jump right into the first question. And this is one that doesn't come from the National Center, but is one I was curious about. So when we talk about home food preservation, how much of this is an art? How much is a science? What's like the percentage?
Well, I'd like to start by saying, first and foremost, I really do consider it a science. But if I had to give percentages overall with all methods of preservation, I'd still probably say 90% science and about 10% art or creativity, you might say, too. Some methods lend themselves better to even just a little creativity, like maybe certain kinds of high sugar jam spreads and some fruit products, or some dried things, but mostly, and especially with canning, it's really a science to be followed.
So this really appeals to food safety educators, many of whom, great to see you guys, are here today. We asked you in doing this talk, we wanted to know from you what were some of the questions you got over your 20 years as head of the National Center for Home Food Preservation at University of Georgia. And you said this following is one that you've heard often. I want to can my own favorite recipe. How do I determine a process so I could safely preserve my own favorite recipe?
Yes, so many factors actually determine the best process that should be used to kill bacteria of concern in a sealed jar that we then want to store at room temperature, which is good growth temperatures for bacteria if they're in there. So you do need to have a safe canning process. And some of the things that play into determining a safe process include the actual ingredients, how those ingredients are prepared, how the mixture is heated or not heated before it goes into your jar and then into the canner, the ratios of liquids to solids in your ingredients, what the covering liquid is, whether it's water, tomato juice, some other kind of sauce, your jar size and shape matter, and even the type of canner you're using can matter. So, as you can imagine, there really aren't any available easy formulas to transfer from one research-based tested recipe to your own types of recipes. And mixtures of foods are almost always going to have lab testing done by a qualified professional in order to determine the heating pattern and rate inside that jar while it's in the canner and to come up with a process time.
Oh, okay. So everything matters. So that's that's scary right there. It's interesting though. People love home canning. So I think that because we're on Facebook, there might be some people who are really quite new to canning. So what would be some core concepts people should keep in mind when we talk about home canning?
All right, yeah, let's define just very few words to get started because they may come up again in some of our later answers. And canning is definitely one of those methods that I would kind of put in the almost pure, if not 100% science of the practice of preserving food. So first, to keep methods standardized and safe, our research methods are going to use some terms that include raw pack and hot pack as ways you prepare food. Raw pack is putting uncooked but properly prepared pieces of food into your jar before then covering those pieces with some kind of hot or boiling liquid. Hot packs, on the other hand, include some versions of heating the food by a prescribed method before it actually gets put into your jar. Two other key terms you're going to see or hear, and as you get into canning, are the terms acid and low acid foods. For the purposes of canning, acid is measured by the pH of a food to determine the proper processing method. And a specific cutoff is related to the risk in particular of botulism, since we're keeping foods at room temperature in vacuum sealed jars, which are conditions that Clostridium botulinum bacteria like. They like low to no oxygen environments. They like pHs in what we call the low acid category. And so it's just good conditions for them to produce a toxin that can not only make us sick, but could even kill us. If a food is over the pH 4.6, then the bacteria that produce this toxin will grow out and do so if not killed during a proper process. So for canning, we call foods with a pH greater than 4.6 low acid foods, and those with a pH of 4.6 or lower acid foods. Your low acid foods are going to include things like meats, poultry, seafood, and most of our vegetables. Acid foods are going to include many of the things we eat as fruits, but not all, and then some pickled products and relishes. And then finally, I'll just say a word about pressure canning as a term and boiling water canning. Pressure canning is needed for these low acid foods since killing the Clostridium botulinum bacteria in its natural form takes a lot of heat. These bacteria exist naturally in what's called a spore form that's very heat resistant. And pressure canning will then allow the temperature inside your canner to get above boiling water so we can kill these spores in a reasonable amount of time. Boiling water canning is done with jars completely submerged in visibly boiling water during the whole required process time and can be used with acid foods. And just because acid foods aren't at risk for botulism, there are other pathogenic or harmful bacteria and spoilage bacteria that need to be killed. So you need a proper process even for boiling water canned foods.
Well, that's an extremely good primer. And I think that Katie's posted some of these core concepts into the comments. So, and we're going to be posting a lot of great links. So thanks for that overview of those concepts. One of the questions you said you heard a lot at the National Center was people asking, why do I have to process my pickles and jams in a canner? My mother didn't do it that way. How would you respond to that?
Yes, there's that question and a lot of other things that mothers did or grandmothers did that we now know are potentially hazardous. I will admit there are some very acid pickled foods and some highly sugared fruit mixtures like some jams, like I've mentioned before, that indeed might be safe without processing the filled jars in a canner, but they still might spoil. And why waste all your ingredients, money, and time only to have the foods maybe mold in the jars as they sit on the shelf and then have to be thrown out? Even a short process can drive air out of the headspace before a lid seals on a canning jar. And by getting that air out, we remove oxygen that can cause browning of foods as they sit on the shelf. So that's a quality feature that I think should be important for a lot of particularly light colored foods. It's also important to realize that mold spores float around us in the air all the time. And so they could get into the jars as you fill your even prepared food into them. And molds will grow in acid pH values and high sugar foods. And they really just need a small amount of oxygen that could be left inside your jar without processing. And that's why I will always recommend for safety and quality that you do use a canner and process all foods.
Oh, floating mold spores. See, we talk about a lot of scary things. No, I get floating mold spores are out there. And I think you're just saying, be mindful that you're dealing with the atmosphere when you're preserving your foods at home. Here's another question you fielded at the National Center. How do I get started with canning? Who do I trust? Who do I trust for information on canning?
Yeah, there are numerous sources, but it's hard to just kind of categorize big, broad, safe categories. So the one I can always recommend would be USDA, which has been the historical source of publicly available research-based information for home canning and properly tested recommended processes. That also means then that the USDA affiliated cooperative extension system is a good source in each state for safe science-based recommendations also. I will admit there are many traditional industry members that produce equipment and supplies that have sound research behind some of their recommendations, or even may use the USDA recommendations in their user manual. But unfortunately, it's not true of all the commercial enterprises these days, so can't make a general recommendation even for all of those. I would say the best place to start is your state extension service, and most of these are going to have local or at least area offices and websites. If they don't happen to have an educator working in this area, when you contact them, they certainly could refer you to someone who can. And then there's the National Center for Home Food Preservation website. That's a great place to start to find all the USDA recommendations, as well as key state recommendations and resources from many states.
We will post some, I think we're going to post a link that helps people identify their co-op extension. I'm so excited to see people from co-op extension here from Washington State, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Oregon, Kentucky. I see USU. So this is great. Incredible resources in food safety generally, but particularly in something like this that's becomes more technical for the home user. So we'll post something about that. So again, we'll try to get to a few questions in the time we have. We're going to be here a fairly short time, so just be sure to post a question in the chat in comments. So let's talk about homemade soup, which is something I love to make. And I would wonder this too. People who say, why do I have to use a pressure canner for my soup? I've already, cooked it to this high temperature. Why have to can soup?
Yes, you see me smiling broadly because this is also a very common question. Yeah. As we've been saying, the canning process really has to kill the very heat-resistant form of bacteria, particularly Clostridium botulinum, in the spore form, and they're not going to be killed by normal cooking temperatures. The most heat-resistant spore of concern is indeed Clostridium botulinum when we're talking about canned foods. We're not going to get sick if we eat the spores that are found in these foods or survive our cooking processes, because the spores don't make us sick. But if those spores are allowed to still exist and not be killed off, but exist inside the closed up jar, airtight jar that's stored at room temperature in low acid canned foods, they are going to grow out into what's called a vegetative bacterial form that's going to start to multiply in your jar and then produce the botulinum toxin in food, which can indeed make us very sick and even kill people. I do want to say you can't tell the toxins in the food by sight or smell. And so you do need to use a properly researched pressure process for low acid foods to know that you kill those spores before storing it. That's another common misconception is people just think, well, they got away with it, say in a boiling water canner, because they don't see anything or smell anything that looks funny. But that's not a clue for bot toxin.
Yeah. Well, like in food safety general, people associate smell or food being bad, but that, of course, is not an indicator that there could be some danger. So this is super important. Well, this is a good overview. We've talked about the 5 common questions you received at the center. Let's see if we have any questions. I think Katie is. Do we have any?
We're waiting to see if questions. I might mention, I noticed a Sharon McDonald on here from Penn State Extension, and I happened to see that she just wrote or was interviewed for an article within the last week with some common questions, and they dovetail what I'd also already sent you as common questions from the National Center.
Well, this is great then. This is wonderful to do this with you and to know that everybody has access to their co-op extension experts for these basic questions. So we have a question. Can you see that
Sure.
on the screen? Great.
I can.
You want to answer that one?
Sure. Here's somebody from a library asking about, that they have some maybe older or different canning books that now may not be considered safe or at least out of date, and asking about maybe distributing updates to them. Unfortunately, most commercial books, unless they put out a new edition, they don't issue any updates to their books. USDA, with a complete guide to home canning, just always makes it known that their latest one is their current recommendations. They don't issue correction sheets to every edition they reprint either. I know we've gotten this question for So Easy to Preserve from the University of Georgia because a lot of libraries stock that. And again, no, we don't issue correction sheets to be put in every copy of the book. We just expect that people need to use the latest version of the book. I personally don't recommend recirculating these old books because you never know whose hands they'll end up in, and they could be using unsafe processes.
Wow, that's such an interesting question. Presumably, is that because there's changes in the technology or?
There are changes in equipment that have occurred, but I noticed that last person's question also mentioned, for example, removing elderberries. And that's something that just has happened in the last few years where low acid elderberry varieties have come to attention. So we were able to remove that from the USDA recommendations off the National Center website. But until they print a new book, they still are listed in even their current book. So that's just an unfortunate situation they're in right now. But that, I would say, is one of the changes that we've had to deal with most often in the last even 5 to 6 years are changing pH values of fruit varieties. We've had to also caution against canning white peaches because they could be low acid, and we don't have anything but an acid process for peaches. And then these berries and different varieties of berries are coming up also. Wow. And I'm sorry, I don't have a real good answer for how to handle other updates to printed books other than to check the website as an individual. And unfortunately, since I'm retired, I'm not in a position to deal with that USDA book anymore. Well,
that's a super interesting, and by the way, to the librarian, very conscientious thought about what do you do with older material that's not verified as safe. We have a lot of questions. Katie, can you queue up another one? Shelley, hi Shelley. Safety concerns of digital pressure canners. I get asked daily if they're safe to use.
Yes, it's been a big thing over the last few years. I and my colleagues who work in this area have yet to see any publicly available research supporting the use of electric multi-cookers for home canning. There are several brands out there now that say you can can in them, but they have not been forthcoming in answering any questions about research to show we have work as intended in them. And it does matter. Lots of things about the equipment, not just the pressure. nor do they even acknowledge they're doing any research or interested in doing it. The most recent, that you've used the word digital, the most recent one out that is using the terminology digital is an electric dedicated canner, not a multi cooker, but a dedicated canner from Presto. And again, I don't have any independent data for you. I do know, compared to some others, they actually have done some research on process work. I was not part of that. I don't know the research, but at least I see that as a positive, that they knew some things had to be looked at. And they did work with one university in doing some of that, at least. I don't know the total involvement there. My message has been, and what you'll find on the National Center is, even with that one, if people want to use these at this point, they need to trust the manufacturer, knowing that we can't independently endorse them.
And they could contact the manufacturer, which in a way also raises the awareness on the part of the manufacturer that people do want this kind of information. All right, let's see. It looks like if we go for till almost 4:30, we could take a couple more questions. So, Katie, you want to cue another one up? And I will remember, you guys may not be seeing them on screen. I'm wondering if you know if at one time there were recommendations for water bath canning green beans. This is Sharon McDonald.
Yes.
I often get calls saying they had the info, but they can't find it.
Correct. Yes, there were. But we're talking decades and decades and decades ago. USDA did their major work in adoption of low acid canning processes in the 1940s. And so prior to that, you may have seen some, and as most of you on here, at least who are educators, know, they may have continued after that, but that doesn't mean they were really recommended, because these things seem to take on a life of their own and never go away. But yes, there indeed were. And there were some people, I'm not sure if it was government or not, but at one time they would tell you just to put some aspirin in the jars, and then that made them safe for boiling water canning. Aspirin is salicylic acid. So they thought adding this acid to their jars would help. And of course, that was not nearly enough acid to make it safe for boiling water canning. But yes, you will hear that, because that used to be, but as I say, we're talking almost a century ago now. The recommendation, because that's all we knew.
This is some fascinating lore. I guess you would not have a headache if you ate that. Let's see. Carol's saying, would you talk about refrigerator pickles that are not heat processed and stored in a fridge? And I guess risk of listeriosis.
Yeah, that's also an interesting question, because when the Complete Guide to Home Canning came out from USDA in 1988, it actually had one procedure in there that was not a canned food. It was a refrigerator dill pickle. But the minute that was published, we actually heard from a few scientists who were studying listeria and saying, wait a minute, do you know if that procedure doesn't put people at risk for listeria? And the part of the procedure, it wasn't just refrigerator stored. It was actually kept at room temperature 7 days for half fermentation and then refrigerated. In any case, so USDA actually withdrew it fairly quickly in a second version of the Complete Guide to Home Canning, recognizing, well, that probably did have to be studied. It actually wasn't studied until the National Center grant about 20 years ago. And we did one research study that showed that it was right to be withdrawn, that there was a listeria survival problem with that procedure. I tried one research study to overcome that failed. It was to give it a heat treatment before refrigerating it, and that just made lousy quality pickles the way we had to do that. So that has not been replaced, but it is a little bit of a concern. If you refrigerate them immediately, I personally think there's less concern. And if you would use the recipes that are meant for canning, they should be acid enough to be okay with immediate. What I still would be concerned about is some procedures for a refrigerator, like half fermented, half sour pickles, that have you keep them at room temperature for any period of time before refrigerating them.
Okay. Interesting. Excellent.
And I'm not saying there aren't safe ones out there, but that would be the risky area.
Yep. All right. I see Vicky has a question. I get many questions related to safety of using pressure canners handed down from family. Oh my gosh. When I was a kid, my mom had a pressure canner and I was terrified of this thing when she used it because this little hopping thing on the top of it and steam shooting out. Okay, what do you say about old equipment, handed down pressure canners?
Well, again, there are some that are probably too old to want to be used. First of all, a lot of those older canners had dial gauges, and you do need a way to test and make sure the dial gauge is accurate, and that's becoming harder and harder to do all the time, especially with old gauges and brands that are even no longer made anymore for canners. Again, you can go back to the 70s and find desirable features, but you definitely want ones, I would say, made after that time, because that's when some other safety features started being built in, like overpressure plugs so that they couldn't explode on you, and safety features built in that you couldn't even take the lid off while there's still pressure in the canner. But I would think the accuracy of the gauge is your number one issue, and then just making sure that it works properly. And you may not be able to find replacement parts for these older canners to make them work properly.
Yep, big concern. Oh my gosh. Hi, Joyce McGarry. Is there research available on alternative lids other than the two-piece metal lids?
Yes, but the only one I really know of that's publicly available is a study that I conducted at the University of Georgia as a master's student project with one of the two-piece plastic lids, reusable plastic lids. Unfortunately, I haven't yet, before retirement, gotten it to a journal article. The thesis is available offline, and I actually hope to soon link to that thesis. Basically, we did 600 jars of food, 200 jars of food in a metal two-piece lid, name brand, in a glass lid with a rubber ring, and in this plastic reusable lid, and a variety of foods, both pressure canned, water bath. There were no red flags raised with these reusable lids. We got very decent vacuum levels. We were not able to study the reusability and what happens if you do use them past the first use or any more than a year's storage time. But we had 2 broken seals in storage, but they were in non-recommended storage because we also challenged them by storing them at excessively high temperatures. But in all the regularly stored ones, there were just no red flags raised on those if people are happy using them.
Okay, well, good to see you too, Joyce.
Yeah.
Summer asks, is the 50-50 vinegar water rule for safe pickles still valid? I use this to determine if home recipes are safe. Thank you, Summer.
Yes, that's a common measurement. The issue with that is it is not just the acidity of the brine that matters if you're pickling, especially for canning. It's how much of that you use to how much vegetable you're pickling. Like, I could use a 50-50 brine with 3 pounds of cucumbers and not get as an acid food if I used it with 2 pounds of cucumbers. So again, if you're doing acidification or pickling for canning safety, you have to look at the ratio of all ingredients in there, not just the vinegar to water. And in some cases, you can even, believe it or not, get a safe pH without even the 50-50 with a little less vinegar, but it all depends on what else is in the recipe and the steps in preparation. So it is a good place to start. It is not going to be the only factor that has to be considered, though.
Thank you. We thank you all for your questions. Katie, I would love you to post again the link to the National Center so that people can get the definitive publications from USDA and other information from the National Center. And so, Elizabeth, why don't you go ahead? I wanted to tell people on Twitter, they can reach you at EA Andress 2021. I don't know if you wanted that said.
That's fine. That's fine.
And let's move to some, what are some closing thoughts you have? given that this is, this continues, as you see by our attendance today, it's a subject of great interest.
Sure. I'll just be a little brief here. We've talked a lot about canning, of course, because that's the method of preservation that seems to generate the most questions and even confusion, especially for beginning canners. So I do have to end by saying, remember to use properly researched processes to produce safe preserves, as well as foods that aren't going to spoil in storage and create food time and money waste. The best place to start, you took care of that by your reposting, is going to be the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning and the National Center. I might just remind you, the Complete Guide to Home Canning has a whole first guide that is some of the science and background. I would not, if you're new, just flip to How Do I Can Peaches. You need to read about the methods and some of the background before you just look right at one food. And then, of course, that guide is posted intact as a formatted pub at the National Center for Home Food Preservation website, as well as broken down into individual pages. At the National Center site, I might put in, you also will find step-by-step methods for freezing and drying of foods, as well as canned pickles, relishes, jams, and jelly recommendations. If you look at the homepage of that website on the left-hand side, you'll see a How Do I section with menus to the different methods of preservation. So those may be the quick reminders, I guess. I just do really caution you, even though you might want to be creative as you are in cooking, to think about this as a science and being safe.
Yes, thank you. I love that people are growing more of their own food and wanting to do home canning. And I think we really just wanted a way to give people access to someone who could speak to how important the science is and the safety. So thank you for being with us.
Sure.
Elizabeth. And all of you, it's great to see all you folks from Co-op Extension. Hopefully many consumers will take a listen to this. We kept it short to half an hour. I want to urge you all to join the Partnership for Food Safety Education at our next event, Wednesday, August 25th at 1 p.m. Eastern. There'll be a webinar. If you follow us here on Facebook, you'll be able to register for that. And we will be releasing a new campaign. And we will be queuing up some great new material for Food Safety Education Month, which is in September. So if you're interested particularly in what's going on with food delivery and how to connect with people about delivered foods and home food safety, please join us on August 25th. And thank you again, Elizabeth, for being with us, and great to see all of you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.